Chapter 55, The Roaring Twenties. Some called the decade of the 1920s the Roaring Twenties. Some called it the Jazz Age, and some the Dance Age. Whichever you chose, it seemed like a time of fun and change. More people had more money than ever before, and mostly they were intent on having a good time. Hardly anyone seemed to worry that some people were left out of the prosperity boom. In 1919, before the 20s began their roar, women's ankles sometimes could be glimpsed beneath long skirts. Those ankles, however, were modestly hidden beneath high-topped shoes. Then skirts started going up and up and up. That made it a tough time to be the parent of a girl. It wasn't easy to be a girl then either. Most women were cutting their hair short. They called it bobbing. Some parents wouldn't allow it. Short hair seemed indecent to the older generation, but up to the minute to those who did it. The girls who weren't allowed to cut their hair felt old-fashioned. Some daring women were wearing bathing suits that left their legs uncovered. Police arrested women on the beaches for doing that. And makeup. Nice women started wearing lipstick, rouge, and powder. The older generation worried, what is the world coming to? Those girls who bobbed their hair and wore short skirts and lipstick were called flappers. They did other things too. They drove automobiles, got jobs, went to the movies, read romantic novels, played ping pong, and danced. My, did they dance. It was the big thing in the 20s, and the big dance was the Charleston. In New York City, Gimbel's department store advertised special Charleston dresses that swung loose on the body. The price was $1.58. When you danced the Charleston, you swung your arms, kicked up your heels, knocked your knees together, and moved frantically. Frantic is a good word to describe the 20s. The idealism of the Wilson years seemed to have come to nothing. After the war, everything was supposed to be better. But anyone could see that it wasn't. And there was the prohibition idea. Americans wanted to have a good nation where all people behaved themselves and didn't get drunk. But that wasn't working either. If you read the newspapers, you could see that criminals were becoming rich and powerful selling liquor. So a lot of Americans in the 20s figured that the best thing to do was to forget about ideals and have a good time, frantically. It was a materialistic age. People concentrated on making money and buying things for themselves. Successful business people became national heroes. There were more rich people than ever before in American history. No one seemed to notice, however, that there were also growing numbers of unemployed people, people who were desperately poor. And many farmers were in terrible trouble. But for most Americans, the time seemed good. The stock market, like women's hems, went up and up and up. Land values boomed. People were able to buy things they never could buy before. In 1920, the car was a novelty. 10 years later, almost every family had a car. Many Americans who didn't have indoor toilets in their homes had motor cars in their yards. The automobile was becoming a necessity. Before the war, life had been slow-paced. Now change was coming with cyclone speed. Ordinary people owned radios and listened to comedy shows and the nightly news. In Florida in 1924, a schoolboy named Red Barber heard radio for the first time at a friend's house. Barber was so excited he stayed up most of the night listening to news from around the nation. It was a new experience. A man in Pittsburgh said it was snowing there. Someone sang in New York. A banjo plunked in Chicago. It was sleeting in New Orleans. Red Barber later became a radio sportscaster. Okay, you can pause this video for a minute and look at the chart here, look at the photo, and you can read the Scopes trial on the green page to yourself. Young people were flocking to the movies, and in 1927, the first talking picture, The Jazz Singer, starred Al Jolson, opened. The following year, in Hollywood, California, a young filmmaker named Walt Disney produced the first animated sound film, Steamboat Willie, and introduced a little mouse named Mickey to the American public. Suddenly, America seemed filled with artistic geniuses, musicians, George Gershwin and Aaron Copland, writers Ernest Hemingway, William Faulkner, and F. Scott Fitzgerald, and artists Mary Cassatt, Grant Wood, and Thomas Hart Benton. And those are just a few of the names. A writer for the jazz age. Francis Scott Fitzgerald, a young Minnesotan, named for ancestor Francis Scott Key, had a tough time in school, but he loved to write. In a short life, he died at age 44. Fitzgerald wrote 5 novels, including one of the greatest American novels, The Great Gatsby, more than 150 short stories, and many essays. Hardly anyone described America of the 1920s and 30s as well as he did. It was he who labeled the times the Jazz Age. His characters tried to turn life into a glittering party, and then he couldn't understand why they weren't happy. Harlem, a part of New York City with a rapidly growing black population, began vibrating with artistry. It was contagious. Playwrights, poets, musicians, artists, and actors, all living within a few blocks of each other, were sharing ideas. Langston Hughes, Claude McKay, and Countee Cullen began writing poetry. Zora Neale Hurston and Jean Toomer wrote novels. Jacob Lawrence and Romare Bearden painted pictures. And Duke Ellington and a whole lot of other people made music. Artistic excellence was something that the segregationists, who believed that different races should be kept separate, couldn't suppress. And Harlem during this time, known as the Harlem Renaissance, exploded with creativity. Migrating north. Between 1910 and 1920, more than 1 million black people headed north. Working conditions in the South were awful, schools were worse, and most blacks couldn't vote. The North held the hope of better jobs, better schooling, and a chance to get ahead. New York's black population, centered in Harlem, increased by 66% in that 10-year period. Chicago's black population, centered in the South Side, increased by 50%. The black migration from field to factory, from rural to urban, continued through most of the century. Jacob Lawrence painted the migration in a series of paintings that are small in size but powerful in impact. And here's one of those paintings right here. You could pause here and read all about jazz in the American original.